Okay, so welcome to Introduction to Water Monitoring. I'm Eric Admin, president of the Sno-King Watershed Council, and we're a all-volunteer nonprofit organization working on protecting streams and advocating for local streams. In this class, we're going to learn about water monitoring, who does it, concepts about watersheds, and how to get going in water monitoring. So here's an outline of our class, what we're going to go over this evening. We're going to talk about the who, what, where, when, why, and how of water monitoring. Talk about some basics, just some watershed terminology, what is a watershed, and some characteristics of a watershed. We'll talk about different types of water pollution. Talk about how water quality is regulated nationally and locally, how you can get started monitoring, and some additional resources you can use and next steps. So first, I'll just talk about my connection to local streams and water monitoring. So I live on a creek called Little Swamp Creek, and I've lived there for a little over 20 years. And that is what got me involved in being interested in local creeks and water monitoring. And so my wife and I observe the creek, what happens to the creek, some of the things that live in the creek. We even occasionally saw a big salmon come up the creek. And so we got interested in local creeks. We also saw that sometimes the creek had some issues, like this picture here, which is an example of what's called high turbidity. So kind of a muddy looking creek. And so we realized that there was also some challenges for local creeks. And that's really living on a creek created my personal connection to creeks. So what is water monitoring? Well, essentially it is just regular systematic assessment of conditions on a body of water. And we're hoping to understand and document conditions and changes with that water body. So that's what it is. Why do we do it? Well, we want to answer a few questions. We want to answer, is it good for fish and wildlife? Is it safe for fishing, swimming, or wading? And what's happening to it? Is it getting better or worse, and why? We know that it's important for recreation. People like to play in the water. I grew up fishing and playing in our local creeks. It's also really important for local salmon, among other things. So we know that you may or may not know, but our local salmon are endangered. In particular, Chinook and sockeye are pretty endangered, and their populations are running pretty low right now. And water quality is a factor in that. In particular, in an urban environment, what happens is you've got something called stormwater, which is water that falls onto the pavement, roads, and other hard surfaces, and it runs off into local creeks, and it can affect water quality as well as water quantity. It can cause what's called scour, so it can run off really rapidly. And so that's another factor in how water quality affects our local salmon. This has a ripple effect on other organisms that rely on the salmon, like orcas. So we've seen lately that our local orca have some issues. And local streams are really important because these are where salmon spawn. So they need good water quality, nice, cold, clear water with high dissolved oxygen content for those eggs that they lay in the gravel beds to be able to successfully grow up and survive. It's not all doom and gloom. However, there are some salmon coming back. And so this is a aerial drone shot taken by Professor Jeff Jensen at the UW-Bothell of sockeye schooling at the mouth of Little Bear Creek in the Sammamish River on September 25th. And he's created a group of local salmon watchers to take over where the King County program left off. And so there are some salmon returning. Okay, let's talk about who monitors water. So this is an example of probably some agency water monitors. So people monitor water for different reasons. Federal, state, local agencies may monitor water for regulatory purposes. So they may be required to monitor water quality. There can be academic organizations that are just studying water quality. And there can also be volunteer groups that monitor water quality, maybe just to educate people, or maybe to try to make something, make a change in the water quality, maybe make it better. Our organization is Sno-King Water Watchers. That's our water quality monitoring group within Sno-King Watershed Council. We're a local water monitoring program operating in Snohomish and King counties. We collect regular data on different water bodies, which include streams primarily, and also some rivers and lakes. We do some environmental education, like the program that we're offering today. We try to increase people's awareness of what's going on with the water bodies, and we can also report issues that we see. We're part of a larger organization called Global Water Watch, and Global Water Watch is an international organization. Their local headquarters are out of Auburn University, and Global Water Watch is the organization that's come up with the training curriculum and the methods that we're using right now. Global Water Watch has a model of community-based watershed stewardship, and these are basically the steps in their model. So taking people and simple technology, teaching them a consistent monitoring approach to use, generates credible data. And then once you have that data, you can take that local knowledge and put it into action in different methods, and ideally result in watershed stewardship and increased quality of life. So that's essentially their model. So some of the different data to action strategies they have: advocacy, so working on changing laws or regulations around water. Restoration and protection activities are some things that community members can do, and also environmental education. So by learning about your stream's health and sharing that information with others, letting people know what you're doing and what you find, you can make a difference. So let's talk about the different types of monitoring that we teach. So one of them is bacteriological water monitoring. And so we collect water samples and incubate them in Petri dishes with enzyme that causes, in particular, E. coli to turn a kind of a dark blue color. And so we can count up what the bacteria levels are in our local creeks. Another type of monitoring that we do is water chemistry monitoring. So this is things like temperature, dissolved oxygen, pH, alkalinity, hardness, and turbidity. This is an example of a high turbidity situation, which we can measure with a turbidity tube. So that's another kind of monitoring that we do. And we also do what's called stream biomonitoring. And so stream biomonitoring is where you look at what are called benthic macroinvertebrates, which basically means the animals that dwell in the benthic zone, which is in the kind of underwater bottom of the stream. They're macroinvertebrates, so they don't have internal skeletons, and they're small enough, but big enough that you can see them with the naked eye. And so these are the creatures, basically mostly insects that live in the bottom of the stream. Some of these have a life stage where they're out of the stream, like flying around like a mayfly, for instance, but they have a large amount of their life they spend in the water. And by looking at which ones are more or less sensitive to water quality, and how many you find of each one, you can come up with an index of water quality. So that's another type of water monitoring that we teach. Okay, we're going to move into some basic concepts about water and watersheds. Probably the major concept to become familiar with is the concept of a watershed itself. So a watershed is an area of land that drains to a common point, which is typically a stream, a lake, or a larger water body. And so if you look at kind of a line along the high points of all the ridges, where all that drains to centrally, that whole area of land is considered a watershed. So if you think about a stream, you can think about a stream or a river as being just that actual stream or river that you see that kind of runs down the center of the watershed. But really, you can think about it more like laid out like a leaf. You know, it's not just the veins on the leaf, it's the whole leaf that encompasses the watershed that really represents that stream. Watersheds exist on different scales. So for instance, the Salish Sea is a major watershed in our area, and a sub watershed of that, but still a pretty large scale watershed, is the Lake Washington Cedar Sammamish watershed. Washington State is divided into different what are called water resource inventory areas. The acronym is RIA. And so these are areas that are organized for purposes of largely managing salmon recovery efforts. And so RIA 8 is one of the, I'll say, biggest in terms of a group that's organized working on Chinook salmon recovery. But that's an example of another watershed. And then I live within the Swamp Creek watershed, which is a sub watershed yet within the RIA 8 Lake Washington Cedar Sammamish watershed. And then even within the Swamp Creek watershed, I live in the Little Swamp Creek watershed, which is an even smaller watershed. So as you become a water monitor, a really important thing to do is learn about your watershed and what's going on in your watershed and what affects it. Another key concept that you should be aware of is what's called the hydrologic cycle. And this is the idea that water is not really created. It just moves from one place to another and one state to another. So it just continuously cycles, and you can just pick a starting point. So if it falls out of the sky as rain and then falls, a certain amount lands on trees, plants, never even hits the ground. They use it, and then some of that will be go back up into the sky in the form of transpiration. Some of it will be soaked into the ground and recharge groundwater. And some of it may just evaporate off the surface of lakes or rivers or the sea. So there's just this kind of continuous cycle of it falls, it gets used, it evaporates or transport or moves back up by transpiration. So they call it evapotranspiration, that process of water going back up into the sky. So essentially, water's never created, it just moves throughout these different cycles. Now, what happens with that hydrologic cycle varies quite a bit in a natural area versus in a city. So in a natural area, most of the water is used by trees, by plants, by organisms in the soil, and ultimately recharging the groundwater. So if you were to look at a stream that flows through a natural area and look at what happens when it rains, you find that the level of the stream comes up very slowly, but then when it quits raining, the level drops more slowly. Where if you look at a stream that's running through an urban area, you find that when it rains, because the water just lands on those hard surfaces and runs off, the water level comes up very rapidly, and then it runs off very rapidly. It quits running off once the rain quits falling. So essentially your stream level would come up very rapidly, and then it would tend to drop rapidly after it quits raining because there's no little groundwater recharge that's happening. And in terms of how much water that is, if we took an example of all the water on the planet as 1 liter in 1 liter container, most of it would be salt water. very little would be freshwater, very little would be groundwater and surface water, and just a tiny fraction would be in lakes and rivers. So the water that we're looking at is actually super precious water. Another concept to be aware of, which can be kind of a little bit confusing, is something called stream order. And so stream order is a way of looking at what is happening in a stream. It's important mainly because as you're closer to the headwaters of a stream compared to the mouth of a stream or river, you have different things going on. So just to go through what the orders are. So if a stream doesn't flow year round, it's considered intermittent or ephemeral, and it doesn't even count as an order. If it flows year round, but it doesn't have any tributaries, it's a first order. And if you have two first orders that come together, you get a second order. 2 seconds make a third, and so on. And the reason why this is important is they have different characteristics. So if you're up on the first order, up on the headwaters, you're going to have more of typically a steeper gradient. I'll show you actually in the next slide, kind of talking about the river continuum. So as you're more towards the first order, you're more towards the headwaters. And so you're going to have a steeper gradient, more of a V-shaped channel. Typically, almost the whole channel is going to be covered by some sort of vegetation, and you'll have certain organisms that are more prevalent. Then as you move downstream and you increase your stream order, the shape of the channel is going to change, how covered it is going to change, until ultimately you get towards the mouth of a water body. And usually if it's a water body of any size, a lot less of it is shaded. The bottom switches from being more like where upstream it was more rocks and cobbles. It tends to be more sediment and sand, more fines, and you have different organisms. So just something to be aware of is that depending on where you're monitoring, you'll find different conditions, and that headwaters to mouth difference is called the river continuum. Okay, we're going to talk about different types of water pollution. So pollution is just categorized in general into point source and non-point source. So point source talks about pollution that comes from a particular thing, like a pipe or a particular drain source. Non-point source is carried off the landscape in general. And really, when water pollution, before there was any thought to controlling water pollution, there was a lot of point sources and a lot of non-point source pollution. Right now, most of point source pollution has really been identified and regulated and somewhat controlled, but non-point source pollution is still a big issue. So getting into the different types of water pollution, one is sediment. So sediment is essentially like particles of dirt that are suspended in the water. And so most of our creeks locally, creeks and rivers, typically have pretty low sediment, especially if you were to go, say, up into the mountains or into a natural area and look into a creek or a river, you'd find it was almost crystal clear. And really, even the urban streams that we have typically are pretty clear. So if you see a high sediment condition in a local creek or river, usually, unless that's a normal condition for it, because it's a larger, slower flowing river, like say the Sammamish River, typically this means that there's some kind of an issue that should be looked into. Another category of water pollution is what we refer to as nutrients. And those are nutrients because they're things that feed plant life and algae. Typically, we're talking about things like nitrates and phosphates. And the biggest issue that we have, or one of the big issues that we have with those, is they promote excess algae growth. And so if you have that in a lake or another large water body, that algae produces toxins that can be poisonous to people and to pets. So that's one of the issues with nutrients. Another general category of water pollution is just toxic substances that run off of roads, for instance. These could be various types of hydrocarbon pollutants, chemicals, oils. One of the biggest ones that's recently been implicated is a chemical that is involved in stabilizing tire rubber for when people manufacture tires. There's a certain chemical that they add to those tires, and that particular chemical, as the tires wear down and people drive around, wears off, gets into the streams, and has been associated with an urban runoff mortality syndrome in salmon. There's also types of things that can cause disease. So I mentioned E. coli previously. That's something, but also there's other types of viruses and other bacteria that can get into water supplies, and they can come from animals or they can come from human sources. One of the projects we're actually working on right now is we're going to be working with some other groups on doing some DNA profiling of the bacteria that are in some of our local creeks, so we can pinpoint exactly where they're coming from. Some things that people can do themselves to reduce water pollution: they can do what's called rainscape, which is using what we call green infrastructure, or things that would encourage the water to not run off their property, but rather be used by plants or be collected for use later. Plant native plants and trees along streams can help with water pollution. Picking up pet waste, washing your car where it doesn't run off into a storm drain, and not using chemicals or fertilizers in your yard, or minimizing it. And we also, I mentioned a couple other green infrastructure things, and a couple other ones are green roofs. So I'm also on the board of the Adopt Stream Foundation. And if you go to the Adopt Stream Foundation and you look at their entrance building, at the little entrance kiosk building, there's an example of a green roof. And the idea is the plants on the roof would use some of the water that falls on it, so that instead of that water just running off, it's used by the plants, and it limits the amount of runoff. Okay, let's talk about the laws that regulate water quality. So once upon a time, there really was little to no regulation of water quality. And so you'd get situations like, this is a famous image of the Cuyahoga River catching on fire. And these type of situations resulted in the passage of the Clean Water Act at a federal level in 1972. And that was kind of the start of regulation of water quality. At the state level, the Washington Administrative Code has a section on freshwater designated uses, and it regulates these criteria: temperature, dissolved oxygen, turbidity, pH, fecal coliform. So those are all have levels that if you find the water quality is not within that specified level, then that's considered water pollution. There's also some other very important state and local regulations that affect water quality. So there's something at the city and county level called a comprehensive plan. Each jurisdiction enacts a comprehensive plan and updates it periodically. And that essentially defines land use and protection around critical areas. So that'll define things like how big is a buffer around a wetland or a creek and things like that. So that affects water quality. There's also land use codes that talk about clearing and grading and what you have to do in terms of erosion control, or what you can clear, when you can clear it. Those affect water quality. For larger bodies of water that are considered waters of the state, there's a body of law called the Shoreline Master Programs that regulates those. A biggie is, and this is probably unfamiliar to a lot of you, it's called the NPDES system, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. So every large commercial operator, but also cities and counties, have to define how they're going to manage stormwater. So they all have to come up with a plan of how they're going to manage stormwater, and then submit that plan to the Department of Ecology, who administers these in Washington State, and they have to approve it. And that defines how they're going to manage stormwater within their jurisdiction or for a commercial operator within their site. So those are a big regulatory area that affects water quality. And then there's also some things like tree ordinances, which can affect water quality, because once you lose a certain amount of tree canopy in your area, that also can adversely affect water quality and the health of the streams. Okay, so you're going to get started water monitoring. What are the steps that you're going to go through? So the first thing you're going to do is define your goals. So what are you trying to do? Why do you want to do this? What sort of things do you want to measure? What do you want to monitor? You want to start gathering some information about your watershed. So you might want to put together a map. You could either find a map online, you could find a paper map, you could create your own map, and then start gathering data about that watershed. So let's say you live in the Swamp Creek watershed. You might go, okay, what are some of the tributary streams to Swamp Creek? Well, a big one is Scriber Creek. Well, where does Scriber Creek come from? Well, Scriber Creek drains almost all of Linwood. So that'd be an example of some watershed data that you might want to know. If you're monitoring Swamp Creek, you might be interested to know that if you're monitoring it downstream from the confluence of Scriber Creek, that a big influence is that source of water coming from Scriber Creek. So that's an example of watershed data. Another example would be what sorts of construction, like a residential development, is going on in my jurisdiction, or where are there major roadways that might deliver pollution? Where's there a beaver dam? There's actually a beaver dam just off of 80th Northeast, about a block from my house in Kenmore. That is something that can influence the water. So just looking at all the different types of things that could affect your watershed. Another thing that you want to do is, if you're monitoring a stream, you want to do what's called a stream walk, where you essentially follow the path of that stream upstream and downstream to see where it goes. It's really helpful to know, like with, for instance, Little Swamp Creek that I monitor, I know that there's certain places where I can walk right up and look at the creek. So if I see an issue at the creek at my house, I can go up to one of those access points, go up to the next one upstream and go, okay, how's it look there? Okay, it still looks like we have some high turbidity. I'm going to go up to the next one. Oh, it's clear there. So the problem I know is in between the two. So finding out where your creek goes and kind of forming a mental image or drawing it on your watershed map can also help you in your water monitoring plan. You want to identify some of the important areas that affect that stream or your watershed. So, what's a major thing that you might want to be aware of? Well, maybe Highway 522 is a key area, or maybe a restoration site. You want to see what's happening above and below a restoration site. That might be an example of a key area. So you just kind of, it's sort of, part of watershed data, but you're identifying where are some important areas in this watershed and along this creek. And then you want to find specific places, a place or places that you might want to evaluate this creek. So maybe it's downstream of a restoration area and it's upstream of a restoration area. That might be an example of some sites that you might want to select. You'll start collecting your data and then put your data to use. So those are the basic steps of water monitoring. In terms of picking your site, there's an acronym that Global Water Watch uses called picking a site with class. So you want one that's convenient, it's legal, so you actually have permission to get there. It's accessible, which means you can actually get down to the water. Safe. So we've had sites that we had to abandon because they became too close to a homeless encampment, for instance. But there's other factors that could make a site that's not safe. So you want to choose a safe one. And then strategic means that site fits into what you're hoping to accomplish with your water monitoring plan. All right, so now you've chosen your site. Now you're going to start collecting and recording data. So using the Global Water Watch system, we have a monitoring site form. So this is a form that you would just go through one time that identifies who you are, information about the water body, the watershed. It's got details about the site, the latitude and the longitude. And this information, if you pick a site that's not already in our system, you give me this information, and then I will enter this into our system and set up a site so that when you go online later, you can enter data associated with this site. We also use what are called data sheets. So for our bacteriological monitoring and our physical and chemical monitoring, we use these standard Global Water Watch data sheets. And we'll get into those in more detail in the class. And we interact with the Global Water Watch system. And so their system tracks the monitors, it tracks the locations, it tracks the data, and then it offers maps and tables and graphs and things that you could use to present and interpret your data. To get to that point, and I don't know if you can see it because where my Zoom control is, but we have on our Sno-King Watershed Council website, we have a Sno-King Water Watchers page, and down at the bottom, right below this picture on the page, there's a hyperlink that takes you to the Global Water Watch site. And so that brings you up to a site that looks like this, and you have some different options where you could either log in, you can just view data, or you can go to a map that shows data by map. When you go to log in, you get this screen here and so once you sign up as a monitor, you'll be issued a user ID and a username, and then that will allow you to enter data into the system. And then you subsequently come to this welcome screen where you can either view data or you can select different types of data that you're going to enter. This is what your data entry screen looks like, and essentially it just corresponds directly to the data sheets that you collect your data on. So you enter your data. So you've gone out, you picked your site, you collected your data, you've entered your data. Now you want to do something with your data. There's different things that you can do to interpret and present that data to others. So one thing you can do is you can use the graphs and charts in the Global Water Watch system. So this is an example of one of our charts showing one of our sites on one of our creeks, Little Swamp Creek, a little bit north of me. And this is showing bacteria levels. And in this graph, the red represents bacteria levels that were too high. So this is something you could use to help people understand what's going on with bacteria levels if you wanted to share this with somebody. You can also produce different forms of a report. So we've produced these stream report cards for some of our sites where we summarize the data that we're finding, what the issues are, and what types of monitoring we're doing. There's a group in Edmonds of youth called Student Saving Salmon. They do water quality monitoring, and they make an annual presentation to their city council. And so that's a very powerful and impactful presentation. So that's another thing that you could do in terms of presenting data, would be give a presentation to your local government if you wanted them to take notice about what's happening with your creek. This is another group that we've worked with in the past. This was a group called the Snohomish Junior Sportsmen, and they were a group of youth at Snohomish High School who took on water quality issues in a lake called Blackman's Lake in the city of Snohomish. And they were having high bacteria levels there. So they put together a public meeting at a fire station that was pretty well attended, and even got some media coverage so they could highlight what's going on with water quality in Blackman's Lake. We have some great volunteers, Bob and Kathy Lieber, who work in Saltwater State Park, and they produce their own set of reports. So they produce these multi-page reports every month showing the cumulative results of the water monitoring that they're finding, where the site is. And then what they do is they post this. They work as part of Friends of Saltwater State Park, and they post this on a kiosk at the park. So people just walking by the kiosk and using the park can get information about the water quality. I really want to mention some additional resources that are great. So I mentioned I'm on the board of the Adopt-A-Stream Foundation as well. And the information that we're going over this evening is pretty brief and at a high summary level. There's a book that you can pick up at Adopt-A-Stream called The Streamkeeper's Field Guide. That's been around for a while, and it's just a fantastic textbook about all of what we're talking about right now, but a lot more in depth as far as how to evaluate a watershed, how to evaluate a stream, how to do different types of water monitoring, so, and how to take action. So I really highly recommend that. And just the Adopt-A-Stream Foundation itself is also a fantastic resource. The Adopt-A-Stream Foundation has the Stream Center, the Northwest Stream Center at McCollum Park in South Everett, where you can go and view a 20-acre restored wetland with an elevated nature trail. You can go online on Adopt-A-Stream and learn the steps of adopting a stream. So this is a fantastic resource as well, the Adopt-A-Stream Foundation. So what can you do next? Learn how to do different types of water monitoring. Learn more about your water body and watershed. Think about your monitoring goals and make a plan. Become a regular monitor and stream keeper. Put your data to work and help make your water body better. So thanks very much. I'm gonna stop the recording right now, and then I will open it up to any comments or questions. So thanks very much.